pedal, pedal, pedal. This is, I need like a bazillion more PSI in here. Maybe a bazillion and 2. This is so soft. Oh my God, oh my.
Here we have the Rocky Mountain Instinct with 140 millimeters of travel, a 150 mil fork, and a carbon fiber frame. This thing weighs in at 14.2 kilos and might just be the most adjustable bike we have on test. It has in-frame storage, chainstay adjustment, a 4-position flip chip, and reach adjustment, making this a bike that can truly be anything you want it to be. But is it a good bike? Rocky does use the unfortunate terminology of quiver killer for this bike, but given all that adjustment, it might just hold true. You can really make it anything from a sharper handling thing to something a little more splayed out, ready for steeper terrain. As to how it performs in those modes, we will get into that with some first impressions and then the full review.
Oh my God, oh my God. Okay, supple, comfortable, maybe elements of comfort that I don't necessarily like. Look, like 80% of the stroke, all the bloody time. Oh my God, the noise. There's just no damping. And then you get your weight over the back and the front just goes so light. You go so far into the deeps, into the stroke, so quickly, the front comes off the ground. What is that? What is that? Okay, so that speed, it feels good. Smooth, medium speed turns, but then even like those bumps and it's unstable. So that was actually my first run of the bike, and I had to sum up how I felt in 3 words. I can't actually remember what they were.
I don't remember either.
But we've got this highly sophisticated.
Secret.
People think we use teleprompters.
No, we got this. Yeah, secret notes from the sky.
So the words that I chose to sum up my first impressions of the Rocky were unstable, light, and undermining.
Underwhelming? Undermining.
It says undermining.
Oh, yeah, undermining, huh?
Undermining, I presume.
Yeah, not after the best start, really.
Not after the best start. You've ridden this bike quite a lot. Mm-hmm. How do you think that was fair for initial impressions as they go?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, there's things that we'll get into it a bit, but there are things you can do to kind of counteract those initial impressions, but it's not a bike that you just hop on and everything feels magical and perfect right from the start.
And if we move away from the idea of initial first impressions and once you've lived with the bike for a bit, are those kind of baked into what the bike is?
I think some of the instability can be. Yeah, like the shock tune on this bike is very a light compression tune, it feels like, and I think that can cause you to feel like the rear wheel is moving a lot, possibly when you don't want it to, so it can feel like you're having trouble, you don't have the level of support that some of these other bikes have.
But isn't that a bit, for our viewers at home, we're always talking about how sensitive or supple shocks are, and now we're saying a wheel moves too much? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you want a range, so ideally, in an ideal world, your bike comes and it's got a little compression dial, say on the rear shock. You could open it up and get a lot of grip, or you can close it down and have a little bit more support. But if you're too far on one side of the spectrum, it's hard to ever get enough support. So I think that's kind of where this bike falls as far as what we found.
Well, before we get to the descending and talk about kind of the really granular side of that, we've got some points on climbing. So this is the lightest frame on test. Oh, sorry, I think one of the lightest frames at least.
I think it might be.
How is it on the climbs? I mean, I felt that I kind of liked the position. It's got quite a long rear end, it's got quite a planted front, but I mean, it might become a bit of a theme. I found it hard to really move past that sort of wallowy mid-stroke. It's a very progressive bike, and so you sit quite deep. What were your impressions climbing on the bike?
Yeah, I mean, and we'll touch more on this, but the adjustability, I think you can find the sweet spots. You could almost make it a climber's bike if you wanted, or bias it more towards the descending, but yeah, in a higher setting, a higher geometry setting, and the shorter chainstays, I found it felt like kind of like you would think a trail bike would feel. It does move a little bit more than some of the other more supportive bikes, but you do kind of get deeper and you get to watch pedal strikes, because if it's moving that much, your pedals are getting closer to the ground. So not the most efficient per se. You might want to even use that climb switch, which a lot of these bikes you can get away without using the climb switch, but this one, yeah, it is pretty active.
Yeah, I was using the climb switch a lot, and then you do get something more efficient, but you do wave goodbye to a lot of that grip as well. And the tracking definitely becomes noticeably worse, although it felt like, as we move on to the next question we've got here, which is how does suspension feel on climbs? It just felt like you're sitting so deep, and it's also, again, like, that compression which would funnily enough, help the descending as well, but also help just give a bit more platform.
Yeah, you're just kind of like sitting up a little bit more solid, even when you're, really technical jumbles of rocks and things, if you can kind of stay above it and kind of glide up them rather than just getting sucked into every single hole. And again, that translates to descents. But yeah, so climbing wise, light bike, you can have the geometry to make it feel like that lighter trail bike. It has lots of traction, so it's super slippery. That rear wheel does stay on the ground pretty well, but you just don't have the level of composure, I'd say, for techie climbs.
And the last of our questions that were kind of sourced between all of the editors and the production team on here who have either ridden the bike or seen us riding and either praising or complaining about the bikes. Does the ride height come into play on the climbs? Now that's something you've already mentioned. This is a bike I did quite a lot of climbing on, and I would say, yeah, actually it really does. It's hard to just feel like, we always feel about kind of feeling like in the bike. This one almost to a fault, I'd say. And it's, we talk about sensitivity, but sensitivity and instability are essentially the same thing, but just tuned. And it's find like a nice spot. And it sounds kind of daft to think that a bike with this much travel that could be ridden on really rowdy enduro tracks, at least could be intended to, you're gonna get something that's unstable going at slow speed climbs, but I would say there are elements of that as well.
Yeah, so the bottom bracket height on this bike is pretty low no matter the geometry setting. So when you get the low bottom bracket and then a lighter compression tune or more active shock, it does kind of exacerbate everything that's happening. Basically, your pedals are getting pretty close to the ground. And so it's, again, probably a knock on it when it comes to overall climbing performance.
Absolutely, and you mentioned there about sort of the adjustability in the bottom bracket height. This does have a wide window of adjustability, and you can get a really nice balance fore and aft on the bike. It would just be interesting to climb on this bike with a bit more of a supportive feel on the shock. For the descending portion, I'm going to pass you over this highly official document.
All right, let's see what we've got. Our first question is comparing the suspension versus the geometry. So if you have really good geometry and maybe not as good suspension, does that make up for it?
It's one for the philosophers. Eh? It's funny. The geometry of this bike, everything about it, to look at it on a chart in the sort of theoretical world, this bike is going to be so good at going high speed. It's going to offer you so much stability, and it's going to just let you absolutely crack on. And in some ways, the geometry sort of plays into the weaknesses of the damping tube, because what it says it's going to do is in direct contradiction to what the shock can offer. Yeah, it was an interesting bike to ride. How did you, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a busy feeling bike. When you're going down, you just feel like there's a lot of, the suspension's moving possibly more than you want it to. Kind of want that calm. We've got the Canyon Spectral, and that review, we're gonna mention how composed that bike is. Like the shock tune, that's another 140 mil bike, but just a drastically different feel. That one just feels like it stays settled. You can go plow through a rock garden and just kind of stays like that. Yes. Where this one, it wants to go just like this. It's just kind of, it's sucking up the bumps kind of, but then it just kind of gets overwhelmed and you just can't really push into it the way you'd want to.
Exactly, and we talked about the sort of the different ways you can describe suspension feel earlier on with the instability thing, but also I'd say that sometimes, great example, and similar on that spot as well, had a really nice suspension feel, and it feels like the wheel's coming into the stroke, when on the Rocky it feels like the rider's mass is falling.
And there's a ton of geometry adjustments on this, including chainstay, which you can change by 10 millimeters. So our next question, how useful are those geometry adjustments? Do you think it's good it has that many, or would you rather have just one bike and you can't change it?
It's funny. It's kind of, I love the idea of adjustment, it definitely isn't a criticism, but it almost means that it's hedging the bets in so many different ways, and it basically says to the end consumer, you make the bike good.
You're right, they can't be wrong if there's this many things. Like, here, it's all this, like, we gave you the ingredients, you messed it up.
Yeah, it's so it's like one of those, those HelloFresh, like, eat at home kits. It sends you the ingredients, and then you end up not following the recipe, and you're like, why doesn't it taste as good? Yeah. I do fundamentally like it. I just think that it's not there's too much adjustment. I think, mate, to be honest, I would probably be saying something different about it if I was able to really enjoy the geometry because of the shock. I find that we're at the position where, we've all ridden this bike a lot, and we all found that in its, shorter setting, less leverage on the shock, but also the neutral, even steeper modes, because they were more linear on the shock. And so all of this adjustments, like, on paper it's really cool, but it's also like, come on now. Like,
yeah. My favorite settings ended up being that shorter chainstay position, I used a little bit shorter reach adjust, which I think
which is really
if we're talking about geometry adjustments, this has a reach adjust headset cup. You can just switch it out, so you can bring the reach back or forward depending on what you'd like. And I was able to shorten it up a little bit, and that's cool. If it could get rid of all the adjustments and just leave reach adjust, and I think that's a really cool, effective one for sizing wise. And then the more steeper setting, it was actually pretty good too.
But it's interesting here how like the trail bike market is one of the non-racing sort of categories. And we often talk about downhill bikes, the adjustment, how amazing that is. And so it seems a bit of an inconsistency to complain about it now. But just with that in mind, I'd say that if you ran a SRAM 121 T-type, you would be...
Yeah, it cuts off an adjustment. So in order to run SRAM's T-type derailleur, you end up with a longer chainstay setting. So you've knocked away one whole setting, which that's not anyone's fault really, but kind of. It's like you have the adjustment, but then you can't. But
to me, it highlights the fact that they have an adjustment there, which is then really pulls it away from what the shock wants to do. And that's what I think is interesting, is it's like, if you're going to commit to maybe one size or maybe fewer adjustments, because it used to be Ride 9, I think.
I'm glad that it's dropped a bit.
Ride 4 now. But it just means that like maybe there isn't so much of onus on optimizing that one particular setting. And it kind of leaves a gray area about what the bike is ultimately end up going to be. Yeah,
it's a bit of a confused bike. And I think that kind of brings us to the next question, where the bike shined. Where it's if you had this bike in the ideal scenario for it.
That's a really interesting
that just stumped you. Yeah, I mean, for me, like...
it's not often that I'm speechless.
Yeah, it's good. I can get in here. This bike, you can make, I think it's definitely more of a trail bike than a mini enduro bike. Even though on paper you can make it really slack and really long, but I think in order to get the most out of it, if you treat it as a trail bike, it's fairly light, and it's pretty active. So you can just kind of make it as like a shorter travel, do it all trail bike rather than trying to push it to the limits. Or even partially to the limits.
Whilst I would say that, I think a closed shock on this bike with more compression damping.
That'd be interesting too.
It'd be very interesting to at least try. But I don't really understand, without going too off script here, I don't really understand. They made this in, I guess they're in Vancouver, just down the road really. Like surely they, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a thing. I don't want to, I think the takeaway is a different shock tune could probably dramatically change this bike. And we've kind of had that with some other Rockies in the past. I don't exactly know where the disconnect is happening, but just for their tunes haven't been matching our preferences. And it's not just us, it's more editors as well. So it's, I don't know, they're just kind of going for a more active feel. Then I think they could kind of tone it back a little bit and really make a good bike.
Yeah, and also it's worth pointing out that the OE tune that brands settle up on isn't the one that maybe they give their professional riders, etc. You can get lots of different tunes, and that's part of making a bike a sort of really optimized final product.
All right, we're getting close to the end of our descending questions. Did it live up to expectations?
After you.
It didn't live up to my expectations. It looks good. Like this bike looks really good on the geometry on paper, but actually like the physical looks of it, it looks nice and sleek and modern. You're like, this bike's gonna be fun. I can make it crazy slack. It's gonna be like a mini enduro thing. And then it's not. And then you're like, well, I'll just steepen it up, make it a cool trail bike thing. And then it's not as much. It's just kind of like, I don't know.
This is in some ways exactly the inverse, like lived experience of the Spot. Which, to be honest, I looked at that and I thought, bloody hell, what's going on there? And that bike is so much fun.
So good.
But Kaz, when I saw you roll down that rock face in that warm-up video, and the noise that came out of both you and the bike.
Oh my God.
The bottom out heard around the world.
Chain fell off. That was bad. That was worse than it should have been.
Yeah.
It just summed up kind of where the bike was at, like I looked at the geometry, I thought this is going to be absolutely amazing. And it was just a case of like an unexpected bottom out.
It just doesn't quite live up to it. But speaking of noise, we should toss this to the garage and see what this bike is like to live with.
All right, we are now in the garage with the Rocky Mountain Instinct. I'm going to talk about some of the little features that make it more or less livable. I'm going to start off with one of the strong suits of this bike. It has, I think, the best frame storage of the bunch. It's a huge opening. We'll have some measurements later. It's got an AirTag mount, which is kind of cool. Just generally a very usable system, super easy to take off, feels watertight, does not rattle at all. Now this bike has the most adjustments on test, and I have found that overall they're very easy to make. This 4-position is something you could just do with a multi-tool trail side if you want to. The chainstay adjustment is a bit more involved, but only takes about 10 minutes. I actually did it in the gondola one day. And then the reach adjustment is just a matter of either flipping those cups around or putting a different one in if you want the 0 reach setting. again, a pretty easy thing to do. Finally, the least livable thing about this bike is the noise that it makes. We found that no matter what we did, there was always some rattling, some clanging. It just felt like it wasn't necessarily the frame being more resonant. There's just a lot of noise coming from different places on the bike. We tried to isolate it to the in-frame storage area. It wasn't just that. Part of it is just the cables moving, even though it has clamps at the entry and exit. Overall, just kind of a noisy bike. A bit frustrating for some, but maybe not a deal breaker for everybody. As an overall livable bike, I'm gonna give this a pretty high rating. I think the adjustments are easy to make, not too complicated, and overall, like, the shock is accessible, the parts are easy to work on, and nothing is too weird or proprietary. So I'm gonna give it a pretty good score in that sense. Now, we're gonna head back into the house, finish up our thoughts on the review, and see who this bike is for.
So that was Dario running us through what this bike is like to live with. Let's talk about the pros and the cons. Do you want to go pros or cons?
Yeah, let's start with the pros.
Pros.
Pros, I think the biggest pro is that level of adjustability. Just a huge range of options, everything from reach to chainstay length to your suspension progression. So that's a huge pro for this bike. Other pros, pretty light. If you want to build up a nice lightweight trail bike, it's got that. And good storage. In-frame storage works well, plenty of room for all your snacks. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the cons would be the arguably underdamped shock. I would say it's noisy. And I would say that if you want to run T-type, you'll be locked in to the one adjustment that we found played worst with the current shock tune. So if those are the pros and cons, who's this bike for then?
Yeah, I think it's for someone that's wanting that kind of more general trail bike. I don't think it's your person that's looking for the mini enduro bike or whatever phrase you want to call it. And it's somebody that doesn't mind tinkering a little bit. With a new shock tune, I think this bike could work really well. It could also be for someone that wants a bike that fits them well. If they're having trouble finding themselves in between sizes on other brands, this one offers a level of adjustment. You could really fine tune it to those exact numbers that you want.
Well, that's it. I think in some ways it's mountain bike. In other ways, it's kind of like a project. Yeah. If you took it on trying to get your perfect sort of trail bike, and wanted to maybe visit how compression damping can really change the feel of a ride, you could get something really, really special. But that's our review on the Rocky Mountain Instinct. Thank you very much for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to keep in touch with all the field test content.